when you look at the career of Bobby Heenan, you're looking at the career of someone widely considered the greatest wrestling manager of all time. And I think in order to properly evaluate his run as a manager, we should talk to some other managers. When you look at the history of Memphis wrestling, one great manager comes to mind. And unfortunately, he's not with us today. But I do have with me Mr. Jim Cornette and Mr. Scott Bowden, both former managers in the Memphis territory.
Poo-Poo couldn't make it.
He's not here today, but I figured you two guys are great guests to discuss this here because not only were you fans of Bobby Heenan, but also you guys worked ringside. You guys did promos. There had to be something, if not many things, that you would learn from watching Bobby Heenan. Jim, you've talked about it a little bit in the past, but briefly here at the top before we go to Scott, when did you first see Bobby Heenan?
Well, and pardon me if I repeat some of the stuff that obviously we addressed it on the Jim Cornette Experience this week. And so pardon me if I repeat myself if you listen to both shows, and I hope you do. But it just because that's, the first thoughts that came to my mind when we were talking about Bobby is he was, when I literally discovered wrestling on television, Bobby was the top manager of Dick the Bruiser's show in Indianapolis that would come in snowily, on Saturday nights after Sammy Terry was off the air, the horror show host. Oh, no, wait, it may have been Science Fiction Theater. Anyway, I digress. It was the time where Bruiser really, it was the best era for the Indianapolis territory where they had all the talent in Baron von Raschke, the Blackjacks, Lanza and Mulligan, Ernie Ladd, Handsome Jimmy Valiant, Bruiser and Crusher, Cowboy Bob Ellis, Sailor Art Thomas. Billy Red Cloud was huge and over. They had not only the Indianapolis territory cooking, but they were fighting the Sheik in Detroit, and they were doing big business there, and they were sending guys to Chicago. So unbeknownst to me, I accidentally found wrestling right during a boom period. And the shows in Indy were doing 10,000 people plus, every 2 or 3 weeks. And so at any rate, Bobby was figured into everything. And, with the main events always featured either Bobby's guys or Bobby wrestling. And I mentioned the famous match with Bruiser and Crusher and Little Bruiser, the midget, and the midget beats up Bobby and his two guys. I stole everything from that. I mean, Scott, anytime you were put in a position as a manager where you had seen Bobby Heenan do something, you did the shit you'd seen Bobby Heenan do because that was what you should do as a manager. He invented a lot of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, I have to say, I sort of feel like Memphis TV manager Boss Winters, the guiding force behind the perennial jobber tag team of the 90s, Rough and Ready, being asked his thoughts on Jimmy Hart's historic run in Jarrett Promotions. But nevertheless, I'm honored to be here. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, Jim, I absolutely, stole all of your best lines, and Jimmy Hart's. But the thing that I loved about Bobby Heenan, was his facial expressions.
Yes.
And just, he just had that natural look of arrogance. And I don't think there's ever been a heel duo that complemented each other so well as Heenan and Bockwinkel. I remember them.
Because and I don't mean to cut you off, but I just did, so I'll make it quick. Bockwinkel was cool and arrogant and looked down his nose at people and had the style and was really the Southern California tan. And Bobby was the clingy, weaselly, pretend Beverly Hills, California bullshit manager that would cling on to a fucking guy like that and try to be just as haughty and just as obnoxious, and then Bobby could fall on his face without Nick having to lose much of his dignity. It was a perfect combination.
Right, and I think Nick was the first to have the jumpsuit with California emblazoned on the back, which could get you major heat in Memphis. And then Bobby followed suit and got his own California jumpsuit. I just wish that Heenan had appeared more in Memphis. I believe he made 3 appearances, one for Lawler's first bout in 1978, right when they switched.
I was there.
Yeah. Actually, I have a issue of Gong Weekly with a full color spread.
I swear to God, we were just talking about that. That was one of my greatest magazine spreads. The picture, everything just came out beautifully.
Oh, it's amazing. And there's this perfect shot of Heenan and Bockwinkel just looking at Lawler like he's nothing. Like, why are we in this redneck town defending the heavyweight championship of the world against this local yokel?
I think it was better that Bobby had actually not appeared in Memphis that much, because when he did come in, everybody'd seen the magazines. Even if you didn't have he had done TBS cable in the late 70s, Georgia. So if you hadn't seen him on cable, you'd read about him in the magazines or somewhere or another, even in Memphis, Tennessee, where he had never. But he worked in the early 70s a couple of times in Louisville when Bruiser was strong arming a piece of the town. He actually came down and worked a couple of preliminary matches. Well, one time with Jimmy Valiant as his partner. And one time a preliminary against Jackie Fargo. It was before I started going, but I wish to God I could have seen Jackie Fargo versus Bobby Heenan.
Well, and and I didn't know until recently that Bockwinkel defended the AWA title against Jackie Fargo in Evansville.
In Evansville, and I was the only witness present, probably still alive. I have pictures of it.
You've got to send me some of those pictures.
It was a clash in styles. I will say that.
Worse than Bockwinkel and Valiant?
No, not that. Actually, because you see, they had the same roots. Because think about it, both of them learned the business in the 50s. It's just Nick aged a little more gracefully than Jackie did. But they were both good workers. It's just that the things that got Jackie over were things that Nick normally didn't do, and vice versa. Right. So it was a little bit odd seeing that, but that was like when worlds collide. You would never expect to see that match as a wrestling fan in the 70s. That's one of those, white whales.
Right.
But anyway, back to Bobby. The point is, when he came in, it was in those days. Briscoe had the aura with the belt, and Race and Bockwinkel, and Bobby being with Bockwinkel, and he was a big money match player by that point. He had been on top for a long time, but I think even what attracted me to him in Indianapolis, he was still at that point, like when I started watching, like 6-7 years in the business, sort of like the WCW NWA era in 88, 89 for me. So I can kind of identify and talking to Bobby a lot. And when we finally were able to get together sometimes, his mom raised him too. And he was a wrestling fan, young, growing up. And there were parallels in terms of not only did he watch wrestling, but if you noticed, he was a consumer of television and movies, and saw what the guys did on the screen in terms of the physical comedians, or just the way people carried themselves, his body language, if he was trying to be haughty. But at the same time, he had that fucking, I mentioned to Brian, when he tried to break the brick with the karate chop and couldn't and sold his hand. There's Jackie Gleason doing Ralph Cramden and the Honeymooners. And so he was one of the early heels in the business that could not only appeal to the people who were with it because he was funny and he was entertaining and hilarious, and they're with it, so that's what they're looking for. But that wasn't a big group of people at the time that was with the wrestling business. So he could still get heat doing the same shit from the people that didn't like him as a heel manager, because he was so good at ringside and at stirring crowds up and at running the baby faces down. It was the old, when I insulted the Rock and Roll Express, it may have been funny, but you don't like it when somebody else calls your wife fat and tells a joke about her, right? It was personal with those people. And he could also appeal to people that didn't even really care about wrestling, but if they were going to watch some wrestling, if it happened to be on television, Bobby Heenan was probably involved in it. So he had everybody. Yeah,
I think that was the only way you could get through 2 hours of primetime wrestling. Seriously, the dialogue between Bobby and Gorilla was just priceless, and that was really the main attraction, the main draw of that show. And another thing I like about Bobby, he had physical comedy down, probably better than any manager around, and made it look believable. And I remember I was talking with Jerry Lawler once about I just started as a heel manager. It wasn't planned. I had about 20 minutes notice before I was a referee before they turned me heel. And I went out there, and my first few promos, I guess they were funny because I was using all, your old stuff and hard sold one-liners. And Lawler said, watch some Bobby Heenan promos. And I did. And one thing that I noticed about Heenan was that he would never go out and call Vern Gagne, a bald old man.
Yeah.
He would go out there and say, Vern Gagne may have more experience in world championship matches than any wrestler around, but Nick Bockwinkel, he's savvier, he's in his prime, and most important, he's got me in his corner. So he wouldn't bury the opponent. He would bring up his strengths, but he would also tell you why his guy was so much better.
Yeah, and also because Vern wrote the checks. I'm sure he would probably be the first one to throw that in. But no, and that's what I learned about Mr. Wrestling too in Louisiana, because I came from Memphis where everybody was a smart ass and everybody was, ripping each other. But the thing was, Jimmy could get away with it when you called, the top baby faces in Memphis names like Lawler or Fabs or Dutch or Valiant or whatever. It was bullshit and people knew it, but when you were ribbing on the square, so to speak, Vern really was old and fat and bald.
Right.
Two really was, ancient at that point, even though he could still kick people's ass, etc. So you stayed away from telling the truth about the babyface when it was derogatory. If it was obviously a lie, you could slander him all day long.
Sure.
And Bobby had that ability to accentuate strengths and not exploit people's weaknesses. He'd figure out some way if he was the matches with Crusher probably at the end there, right before he left. Crusher was fucking almost 60 at that point. So, but he still kept Crusher having the aura of the baddest man in Milwaukee like he always had and everything. He knew to play to people's strengths, and he knew what he could get away with. And physically, that's what I remember most about Bruiser's TV show and falling in love with wrestling, was seeing Heenan get shot across the ring and taken to fucking backwards, upside down, over the top rope, just fucking like poetry.
Better than Flair, really.
Well, yeah, Flair was going in forward, so at least he was seeing where he was going. But also, it was a little more stagey the way Rick did, because he was imitating Stevens, and Bobby kind of, did his own thing with it. But the point is, physically, not only being willing to bleed, but also being willing to get his ass kicked. But the bumps he could take, and the timing, and the way he learned to work from scratch, was just some. And when I'm sure you got the same thing I got. On the job training, okay, they'll throw you, figure out how to fall, and then guys will give you a couple of tips when they see you land on your head, and they're like, no, you shouldn't do it that way, and then they'll tell you something, and you just practice, right? As you're on the shows. We didn't have practice. We had practice on the shows.
Yeah, and if you got your nose broken or your jaw broken, it's good for the business.
Take pictures. Yes, pictures of my stitches in my cheek and my fucking swollen eye, whatever. Anyway, we got thrown into that and trying to emulate. He was just, that was like trying to work like the Dynamite Kid. I could take the manager bumps. I could drop the elbow and get slammed and slingshot it in over the top rope, but Bobby was just way above all of us as far as anything. He was a better worker than most of the guys that he managed.
Well, I think the biggest compliment that you could give to Bobby, I read an interview with Bockwinkel, and he said that when Heenan was managing he and Stevens, that if something happened and one of them was injured and couldn't work that night, that Bobby could step in and the team would miss a beat.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, they would have a great match, but it'd be worked completely differently because Bobby would work like a manager should.
Sure.
And, my God, from people saw me at the Great American Bashes with the matches with the Fantastics, the Rock and Roll, or the top baby faces, or in Louisiana, all those things. To tag in and get some heat, but then the baby face bows up. I mean, not specifically move for move, one foot in front of the other thievery of Bobby's spots, but the whole idea of the thing, the pace of the match, the way that the manager won't take the tag from his man and is indignant at the thought of it when the baby face is cooking and the guy needs some relief, but he's anxious to get in when the tables are turned and the baby face is down, so because he's a glory hog, but he of course will try too hard and think he's got what he doesn't have, and he'll miss, and that will be the turning point. Anytime a manager is involved in a wrestling match, or a manager is at ringside, or like handcuffed to the guy at ringside, another of the baby face. I've stolen stuff where he was handcuffed to Sam Menaker, or any type of specialty stipulation involving a manager. I saw Bobby Heenan do stuff and would take off and vamp from there and ad lib or riff, as the kids say, coming up with my own shit. But it was in the flavor of that, because it was priceless. It was perfect.
And he had a bit of a lisp, and and he would come up with these Vegas stand-up comedian type one-liners, but it made it sound like very fresh, like he had just thought of it, and he would kind of stumble over it sometimes, like his delivery wasn't smooth, like yours in your heyday in Mid-South and Mid-Atlantic. But I don't know
if I was smooth. I just said a lot of words in a row until I figured out what I was talking about. That's not necessarily smooth, but I know where you're going. But that was because he did have just the little thing with his speech, but it made him sound like more of kind of like a fucking asshole.
Right. Yeah.
When he was really getting heat. And I mean, in the 60s and 70s, for as beloved as the beloved Brain the Weasel was, and Gorilla with Primetime Wrestling and etc., or Raw, or later WCW, he had a ton of heat. He and Bockwinkel got shot at in Chicago that time. And he was the recipient of a ton of abuse because he was the classic, young, loudmouthed, allegedly, somewhat wealthy. They didn't take it as far as, with me ripping off the Gary Hart thing, the wealthy family or whatever, but he was, a playboy type, flashy jackets, bleached blonde hair. They wanted him to think he was gay. And especially, when he was first paired with Jack Lanza in the 60s, and Meltzer had a great point in the Observer, or on the website at least, talking about that Bobby was the only manager that only heel manager Sam Muchnick ever used in St. Louis, because he was so instrumental to why Lanza was one of the top heels in the business, and they were a team. But Sam just didn't like the idea of heel managers, but for that he had to make an exception, and they were a big draw in the late 60s in St. Louis, as well as, in the Midwest. And you know how Bobby got the name Bobby, did he ever tell you that story?
No,
his name was Ray Heenan, and he was the jacket carrier and all around, stooge to get in the matches for free, and like 20 years old or whatever the fuck. And they told him to go to the office. Did they tell him to go to the office? Well, read his book, buy his book and read it. All of them, whichever ones he wrote. But he was either told to go to the office or told to report to the office, and already told why, because he was going to get into business. He was going to Louisville. He was going to manage the Assassins, who were not Jody Hamilton and Tom Ernesto at the time. The Midwest Assassins, I can't remember. Joe Tommaso, I think, may have been one of them.
And anyway, John Hill and Guy Mitchell.
Well, there you go. And who became Stomper Guy Mitchell, and the Masked Strangler, and was in and out, and Jerry Valiant, and was in and out of the Midwest and everything for ages. Anyway, the point is, he's sitting in the office, in the outer office, and some fans come by, and they obviously think he's a wrestling personality. They asked for his autograph. He didn't know what name to sign, and then they kept calling him Bobby. Okay, Bobby. What? No, my name's Ray. Okay, Bobby. And they said, why you call me Bobby? Because you're a manager, and Bobby Davis was the manager that they were envisioning. The young, glib, chipmunk-cheeked fucking smartass in the fucking fancy clothes. And he had been kind of him and Red Berry and a few others, Leo the Lion Newman, but Bobby Davis was the prototype for me, prototype for Bobby Heenan, the prototype for any young, wise-ass manager.
All right.
So his name became Bobby Heenans. Then he knew what name to sign. and and from scratch, from the ring crew, but he kind of knew what the fuck it was supposed to look like, and within a couple of years he was a main event guy.
Isn't it amazing? Like all these guys, like Jimmy Hart, he sold Cokes at Ellis Auditorium just so he could get into the matches. I helped set up the ring so I could just be backstage and kind of hang with the guys. I mean, all these people
Bobby Eaton and his friend Orville Hutto would hang out in Huntsville to set up the ring to get in free, and they'd get practice beforehand, which is how he got booked. Because some of the guys noticed that he looked like just fucking around in the ring. He looked like that he had already been trained. So there you go.
Yep.
And with Bobby, let's put it this way. He told me some of the reasons why he was not a member of the Dick the Bruiser fan club, because Bruiser was hard on him. And especially when he was the Gopher Kid. But even after he got into business, and he felt like that even, after he was main eventing and Bruiser's territory is doing the biggest business it's ever done. And, he didn't get paid like a star. He got paid like the kid that had been there. That's why he gave his notice and went to work for Vern. And the big 1974 Chic Bruiser blow off that he was involved in, I think was the final straw where he got like $800 or something. It's like, okay.
Well, and for Vern, wasn't he working like 4 shots a night? Like he would actually wrestle in a match against Gagne, maybe in a weasel suit match, and then he'd manage 3 other guys, and so he was constantly out there.
Yeah, I mean, I've done the same thing in a variety of places. Also, that was because that he had the Heenan family, which of course then. Jimmy Hart didn't copy, but Jimmy had the first family. And I mean, it was hardly original for a bunch of heels to be congregated together, but he kind of made it cool and mainstream. Before the Horsemen, there was this top manager from Beverly Hills and all these stars that were, wherever he was part of the Heenan family. Mm-hmm. And they were always main event guys. So, that basically just got it. So then, of course, there's the pressure, right? Is the curse of being able to work. He Kansas City'd himself. Every time he'd, go out, he added to the match, so everybody wanted him out in the match. Right. The guys in the match wanted, please, Bobby.
Right. Because instant heat.
Yeah. So, and but then again, when you think about it, he didn't have a big problem with overexposure because he was still as over after 7-8 years in the AWA as he was when he started, more so.
Yeah. And then to make that transition from managing to broadcasting, which is a completely different animal. I mean, it's one thing to go out there and cut, as you know, I mean, a 30-second or a 60-second promo, and then you're done. But to, carry an entire show and to be able to weave in all the story elements of a match going on.
Or you're having a small stroke there, the story elements.
Yeah,
story elements are very important. No, well, here's the thing. I can tell you, I've done it both ways. I've done it the right way and the wrong way. Right way is better. But when Dusty, during the summer of 1986, on all the TVs, he had me doing color commentary with the normal announcing crew just to make me as annoying as possible. Because I was in all the bash matches where either the Dusty and Magnum were going to get me, or Baby Doll was going to get me, the Rock and Roll was going to get me, Road Warriors going to get me, somebody's going to get me. So he put me out there, and I was being a manager and being an obnoxious, annoying manager. And obviously, I'd watched wrestling so long that I knew what not to just bury the guys and how to kind of get the shit over that they were doing, as well as being obnoxious. But I was primarily, as I go back and look at it, just being a manager sounding off. Whereas then a couple of years later, when I got to do it with JR, he sat me down and said, okay, well, now here's how you're going to be a real color guy now instead of a manager acting like it. And with Bobby, because he was always unselfish anyway, at least to me and everybody that I've talked to, he didn't have to talk about himself so much. And he didn't have to make his shit the center of attention when it shouldn't be, because somebody else's shit's trying to get over. He knew that right off the bat, and just because he was, anxious to get other people over. That's why he introduced Lawler. People tweeted that on his debut on WWF television. And then he introduced me, and not only that, but gave me the big hug and hopped up and down with me and just, doing everything he could again. Probably at that point, probably was pretty convinced he was about to leave anyway, and so was trying to do something, I think, for me in hindsight on the way out, because he wasn't there a few weeks longer and left and went south.
Yeah, it sort of comes off like that was the passing of the torch, really.
Well, and actually, in a way, even though Bobby wasn't managing anymore at that point, he was the announcer. He was the guy on WWF television that they considered the greatest manager, even if he wasn't managed anymore. I can't remember who all else was there, but everybody would think Bobby was the best. So when I come in, fucking, Mr. NWA anti-fucking New York wrestling guy, he automatically, he's the greatest. Oh, fuck. Pardon me while I rub my nipples.
Hey, Jim, let me ask you this. So if you get started and you're a young fan and you're watching Bobby Heenan, what is the shock like when all of a sudden in 74 he leaves Indianapolis? Of course, he's still working in Chicago, but you wouldn't have been seeing that TV. But he leaves working for the Bruiser in Indianapolis, and now there's other managers. There's no more Bobby Heenan.
God.
What's it like when you go from Bobby Heenan to what comes next? And I'm asking this of two people who watched Mickey Poole as a manager in Memphis, so I know you guys have seen...
Yeah, but he wasn't really... he was Lawler's fucking stooge. He could have been a limo driver or fucking, whatever, fucker or guy that mops up. But actual managers, and boy, one of the... because I don't have the books in front of me that would tell me this, so I'm going to defer to the guys that know Midwest wrestling history, but I believe that Bobby Heenan was followed by Handsome Johnny Starr, who was a fairly good little hand as a worker, and also could talk a little bit and didn't look bad, but it was just like following, the fucking Sunday brunch at the Waldorf Astoria with goddamn microwave Hardee's burger. Because nothing could have been. And then Major Duke George was in there, and that was brutal. And then later, and that's actually why the Indianapolis territory died. And Jimmy Kent was there with the Bounty Hunters, and he was all right, but it just wasn't, I mean, and also because Bobby was from Indianapolis and everybody knew it. I mean, he was when they went to WrestleMania or went there for WrestleMania years later, the focus of the media of WrestleMania was on Bobby Heenan, Indiana's favorite Bobby, instead of Bobby Knight. He was everywhere. But Bobby leaving was even worse because that's when they lost the promotional war in Detroit to the Sheik and agreed to all make up. And they pulled out of Detroit, which meant they were running 2 less major market shows per month. And they had somewhat of a constricting of the territory. A lot of the top talent left about that time, maybe because Bruiser was cheap also. Who knows? I don't want to get Bruiser's fucking son-in-laws or family or whatever on me here. So Bobby left, and you weren't seeing guys like the Valiant Brothers anymore. All of a sudden, you were seeing the Bounty Hunters, and which was fine. But you didn't have the Blackjacks, you didn't have the Baron von Raschke's and the Cowboy Bob Ellis's and the guys that had been over there since the dawn of time. It was, more mid-level guys being pushed into. Paul Christie became a top heel, for fuck's sake. By the end of the decade, and. So that's what really killed the territory. The glory years were Bobby Heenan and his guys against Bruiser and Crusher and Bob Ellis and Bruno Sammartino came in. They were seeing Bruno, for fuck's sake, in Indianapolis when they couldn't see him in New York. That's one of the few at times he actually went and worked a territory there at that point. So they had major league talent, and then it went sideways pretty quick.
Sounds a lot like the AWA as well, because they lost Hogan and then Ventura. And then I believe that's when Heenan made the call to Hogan to get in.
Yeah, well, it was the same thing about not quite 10 years later. But, excuse me, the territories kept. Sheik's territory aged itself out of business. Bruiser's aged itself out of business. And then Vern's kind of aged itself out of business because – Crusher and Mad Dog were still on top, and they were close to 60. And the spread of television started to expose these things. And places that didn't get hit by that were places like the Carolinas and Georgia, Florida, that always really had young talent that could go in the ring, and it wasn't quite as much of a shock when they saw other athletes other places.
Right.
With the AWA, it's interesting, and I've heard people with this idea, and I know Richard Vychek's a subscriber that Indianapolis died or began its death march after Heenan left in 74, and I've heard people make a similar argument about the AWA. Sure, they lose Gene Okerlund, Hulk Hogan, and David Schultz at the end of 83, and as 84 is happening, Vince is raiding anyone and everyone he can get from that office, whether you're behind the camera, whether you're in front of the camera, and eventually Heenan. A lot of people do think that it wasn't really Hogan that killed the AWA or hurt it as much as losing Heenan. And when you look at it, the crowds did hold up in 84. And you had the Road Warriors in there, but then you lose Bobby, who had really been the mainstay for a decade.
Yeah. And he had all the credibility for the new heels to come in and instantly be main event guys if they were with him. So that I mean, it all played a part. It was all swinging in that direction. But though he was a key guy in 2 different decades in 2 different territories that were booming and busted not long after he left.
Supposedly, Heenan was not clued in on the finish to the Otto Wan's title switch.
Oh, I remember hearing about that.
And I just watched it this week because Otto recently passed away as well. And Bobby goes ballistic, and you can see him talking to the referee, who I believe is the Crusher's son,
Larry Lisowski.
Yes, and I guess, but in a quick moment, Bobby accepts the finish, and he climbs into the ring to protest, trips over the ropes, and falls flat on his face.
Yeah,
I mean, just a classic physical comedy moment.
He was probably also trying to trip and fall so he could get nearer to where Bockwinkel was selling, so he could say, "What the fuck, Nicholas, you fucking prick!" Because I guarantee you, he had to instantly think that was the biggest fuck up that had ever happened, and his heart probably stopped, because of all things that Bobby Heenan at ringside that night during that match was confident of, was that there was going to be neither a double cross nor a title switch with that, and bless him because he's gone, but at the time of fat tub of non-working goo like Otto Bonds, that was a big deal in his home country and was a huge promoter, which is why he was in this spot. But that's the last thing that Bobby Heenan expected to see. He would have looked up and believed he'd seen donkeys flying over before he would believe that belt was going to go to Otto Von. So that was classic.
Unbelievable.
What do you guys think you can learn from watching Bobby Heenan in terms of how he behaved at ringside?
To me, just the intensity that he would show whenever his guy was in trouble, or like Bockwinkel losing the title, he just absolutely went nuts. Now, it could have been just because he didn't know the finish, but I think he would have reacted that way anyway. It made every match seem important, and when his guy was on the losing end or in trouble or on the ropes, his face, again, it's his facial expressions. He's arguing with the referee. He's so engaged in the match. Unlike, a lot of the managers in New York, they would just walk the guys to the ring and then and go back to the dressing room. That was the easiest gig in wrestling. Either
that or stand there and lean there, like, because they didn't need to do anything. They'd have a riot, but it was a boring existence.
Right.
But you're right with Bobby. If there's 5,000 people in a building, if 4,999 are watching the match, but one person's looking at Bobby, the expression on his face, his body language, whether he's tense or happy or upset or nervous or whatever, is still right. Because he reacts, but he's not out there doing goddamn cartwheels and screaming, look at me, and honking fucking air horns and as a manager to drum up heat. He is coaching his guy. He's leading his guy. He's cheering for his guy. If his guy's doing well, he's happy and he's cocky. If his guy is not, he's fucking selling it himself and like, oh, fuck. He's not calling attention to himself when the ball is in play, as Jim Ross would say, in the ring, when a spot's being run or something's going on that people should be looking at, then he's looking at it and reacting to it in his own little world. But if the guy's got a fucking chin lock and they're calling a spot, or somebody's checking his fucking teeth, that's when Bobby can go into, and that's what I would always go into, fucking overdrive and turn to the people and say, look at him now. What do you think of him now? The fucking punk. And get them to look at me for a second, get a little heat. Don't see the fucking lips moving in the chin lock when they're calling a fucking spot, and then turn back around and start watching again. He could do all of those things. So he wasn't taking attention away, but he was keeping them interested in points where they might not normally have been interested.
Well, especially like on a false finish, in Bockwinkel's matches, there were so many times when a guy, got like a 2.5 count, and Bobby looked like he was about to have a heart attack each time. I mean, with sweat pouring down his brow, just selling it perfectly.
Oh, plus you tweeted the when Lawler gave him the double head bonk spot, and see, Bockwinkel would come with the towel, and then Bobby would hold the towel, and so he'd have a towel in his hand. So every time they did the double head bonk, both of them fling their arms up. Plus, Bobby's got the towel, and their head motion was perfect, and it just was so visual. I always liked to do that with Bobby Eaton because it was perfect. And even if you didn't know what you were doing, it looked great and he never hurt you. But just stuff like that. He was, he knew to fucking step the foot over the, when you had the old restraining rope around the ring, like the little, not velvet rope, but just rope clothesline. Mm-hmm. And he knew to step over the goddamn thing and tie his leg in it before he turned around to argue with the referee, so he'd look like a buffoon when he was tied up in the thing and tripped. Or the way to sell his arm in it just in the nick of time, so it would make it even more, and you would steal all that too as you went along. I stole a bunch of that in Smoky Mountain spot shows, I'll tell you that. just to fucking 4 matches on a fucking card, we got to go 2 hours. There was plenty of gaga.
We know that the fans in Chicago and Indianapolis, the familiar chant was, "We want blood." And usually it was one person's blood specifically they were asking for. And that was Bobby Heenan's, and he probably has spilled more blood than any other wrestling manager in history, I would say. Correct?
I have to, Albano, but that was, it wasn't even the same way. And, Lou had his issues at times with blading, whether it needed to be done or not, and how much needed to be done. But for purely drawing money, to come to see Bobby Heenan get busted open and be left in a bloody, quivering mass, yes, he would have definitely not only have bled more, but also have sold more tickets while doing it, I think, than boy, Indianapolis was a blood territory, especially for Bruiser's opponents. So Chicago, they would chant, "We want blood, we want blood." I've watched some of the old Bob Luce films. If Bruiser and Crusher, 2 out of 3 falls against Bockwinkel and Stevens. The people are so close around the ring, it looks like the front row is a lumberjack match, right? In the old International Amphitheater days. And there's like uniformed Chicago City police jammed in between this close front row and the ring with their backs to the ring watching the people. And the only break in that is for a press table that's just jammed in there with fucking athletic commission people. So it's a sea of people. You can't take a bump through the ropes to the floor without landing on a cop, a fan, or a fucking commissioner. And Bruiser and Crusher beat Bockwinkel and Stevens up for the entire first fall and probably get juice on Stevens and then pin one of them 1, 2, 3 with a foot on the chest. And then the second fall, Bockwinkel and Stevens get enough of heat on one of them. They won't go down, but they can scratch their eyes or whatever, or hit them with a foreign object that brings them to their knees, where maybe Bruiser will get a little juice over his right eye. And then somehow Bockwinkel and Stevens will win on disqualification when they come back and take the foreign object away. And so it's 1 fall apiece. And then in the third fall, all the Bruiser and Crusher do is just jerk Bockwinkel and Stevens both in, get juice on both of them, jerk Heenan in, beat fuck out of him, beat him up bloody, and then pin one of them and win the match. And they would come back with fucking rematches 2 weeks later. Somehow they would still have heat. It's a goddamn, and the people be chanting, "We want blood. We want blood." Do a psychological study of the International Amphitheater in the early 70s on wrestling night when it was sold out, and tell me how many people honestly believed wrestling was real at that point. You would have probably gotten a significant number.
Well, and I think the greatest wrestling magazine cover of all time, I believe it's a 1974 issue of The Wrestler with Bobby Heenan's face, just talk about a crimson mask.
My God, Bobby, what happened to your face?
Right.
I and that was it was, and somebody tweeted this. I have the magazine, but the match was Bobby Heenan and one of the heels against Bruiser and George Ringo, the wrestling Beetle, who was Bob Sabray, the old wrestling photographer, Midwest wrestling photographer, and he got credit in a lot of the early After magazines, late '60s, early '70s. Bob Sabre, but he became George Ringo, the wrestling Beetle, and it wasn't even '70. It was more like 1970, '71. But his face is just completely covered. It looks like he's been run through a razor blade factory.
Well, I am proud to say that I noticed I was booking in a hospital elimination match in Memphis, and I went up to Randy Hales and I said, "Randy, we talked about this. I'm not going to get color." And he goes, "We'll work it out on Monday." And he and Lawler kind of did this good cop, bad cop kind of thing, where Lawler came in and he's like, I know Randy's making you do this. Look, if you don't want to do it, you don't want to do it. But Scott, I wouldn't ask you to do anything I haven't done 100 times. I mean, how many times have you paid to see me get blood? And I went, by God, I'm going to do it. I couldn't wait to get out there.
Yeah. Once Lawler got finished with you. Yeah. You here, can you just stick something in my carotid and drain it into a bucket?
And they said, well, Dream Machine can do it for you. And I went, no, I was like, no, thank you. But man, I hit a gusher, I have to say. Well,
the rib on me is every time that I've gotten juice intentionally. There's been a few I didn't know I was going to go into until it happened. But anytime I've gotten juice intentionally in the wrestling business has been my idea for an angle of mine. Whether it's Paul Lee or whether it's Bullet Bob Armstrong or whether and so I'm the gangsters. So I'm a complete idiot. We've established that right now. But no, Bobby was and to be honest, goddamn, he has to have bled much more than Bobby Eaton. Yet Bobby Eaton's forehead looked a lot worse by the time he got out of the ring than Bobby Heenan's did. Yeah, I guess Bobby Eaton was just fair complected, but Bobby Heenan, he was an artist with that too, because he did it well.
In closing, I'm going to ask you each the same question. I'll start with you, Scott. Scott, what was your favorite moment of Bobby Heenan's career, and what impact, if any, did he have on your career as a manager?
I think it was, again, it goes back to facial expressions and reacting to what your fellow announcer is saying, or, paying attention to, reacting to what Lance Russell is saying to me. There were so many times where Bobby would come up with some kind of ridiculous fact, and Gorilla would correct him, and Heenan would just kind of do a double take and go, well, and that was his comeback. Just kind of a smirk and a well, and that taught me to really listen to what Lance was saying and react to that. And Jerry Lawler was so good at that as well. And I also loved, because again, I did watch primetime wrestling strictly to hear Heenan and Gorilla's, the rapport that they had. And I loved how Gorilla would, he's hosting the show, he would introduce it. And then Bobby would just deadpan, and I'm your host, Bobby the Brain Heenan. And that got a pop from me every single time.
What's your favorite Bobby Heenan memory?
Well, I think his reaction, seriously, to the title loss to Otto Wands, him going crazy, and then he goes into protest and trips over the rope and falls flat on his face. I mean, whether it was planned or not, that was just absolutely hilarious and classic.
Oh, I guarantee you, that's what I've seen him take that bump of me. I stole that from him too. Trying to jump in the ring at the nick of time and falling. Oh my God. Everything that Bobby did in the ring was exactly what he meant to do at exactly that time, as far as I could tell.
Jim, same two questions for you. What is your favorite Bobby Heenan memory? And also, what impact did he have, if any, on your career as a manager?
Well, I've pretty much answered that. He showed me how to do it just by watching him on TV. And that was the thing, not as a kid. And I mean, obviously, I didn't get to see him in the AWA except like when he'd come down to Memphis with Bockwinkel a few times until VCRs came in. So the latter half of the 70s, after he left Indianapolis, I was reading the magazines and etc. But then VCRs, I was able to see the stuff in the AWA. Obviously, when he left and went to the WWF, that TV was really visible, and that would, pretty much takes us to the end of his managing career. But what I will always remember is that he was on the first big league TV show I saw and was pretty much the star of that show. And not only even though I wasn't smart to the business, I'm trying to remember what it was like when you're 10 or 11 or 12 years old and you remember the matches, but you try to get in the same frame of mind to where you can look at them like you didn't know that there was somebody telling you what to do, and you didn't know there was a booker. You didn't know how this shit was worked. Every once in a while you could see it, something didn't look exactly fucking kosher, but you didn't know what was going on, right? And you were supposed to not like the bad guys and like the good guys, and it was real easy to like Dick the Bruiser. But as far as promos and on television, the interviews that would talk you into wanting to see the shit, besides Bruiser, there were some pretty boring-ass babyface promos in Indianapolis at the time. They were already over for 15 years. They didn't need to be good. But Bobby was just every time. It was the standout. And if Bobby Heenan was in a match, that's when I really wanted to watch it. Sometimes they would show reruns. Bruiser would show reruns because he'd tape 2 shows at the Expo Center and either not show the main event or have the main event run out of time. Blackjack Mulligan, Dick the Bruiser chain match. The bell rings to start the fucking thing. We're out of time. But they wouldn't run but every 3 weeks. So every third week they'd show a rerun. And I watched some matches that Bobby Heenan was involved in 5, 6, 7 times by the time that they'd finished, running that show. And you would watch and wait for him to get into the ring because that was good. No matter who was wrestling, you knew as soon as Bobby was in there, it just fucking blew. It just fucking popped. The whole tempo changed. The people went crazy. The match all of a sudden got fucking wild. He did his shit and stole the show. So both physically and talking and just doing what managers are supposed to do. He was the bridge. Bobby Davis was kind of the prototype, and from all accounts that I've seen was nowhere near as animated nor, but he looked good in the pictures with Buddy Rogers. But Bobby Heenan grew up watching guys like that, and he thought, I'm sure when he was a kid, well, what about if the guy did that or this? So I'm sure that's what he was doing. He was making the shit up as we went along, and now the heel managers that followed him had entertaining shit that they could steal if they were put in a straitjacket or if they were handcuffed to somebody or if they were put in a cage or if they were in a match with a midget or whatever the fuck. And then you just do your own shit. But it's like he was the Chuck Berry of the thing. He invented the genre and then we just rewrote the songs, right? Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the impact, the effect he had on me. I'll try not to say impact. I'll say the effect he had on me.